Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box so that we can all get to know each other. If you have any questions or need any tech assistance, feel free to reach out in the chat box as well. All right, I think we can get started. We have a lot of people joining us and continuing to join us today. So we're very excited about that. So we'll get started and then, people can just join in, I guess. So good afternoon. Hello to everyone who has joined us today, friends and comrades from many, many parts of the world. It is a huge honor to be here, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to this Asia Pacific focused discussion on demystifying false climate solutions and their impacts, organized by the Global Forest Coalition. As most of you know, the GFC is an international coalition of NGOs and indigenous peoples organizations defending social justice and the rights of forest people in forest policies around the world. Currently, we have about 124 member groups based in 72 countries around the world. So happy to see that the introductions are coming into the chat box. Yes, so please introduce yourselves. In the chat, we'd love to hear from you, who you are, where you're joining us from, what interests you about this webinar. So feel free to go ahead. My name is Chitira Vijay Kumar. My pronouns are they and them. I'm the communications coordinator of the Global Forest Coalition, and I'm a journalist and a researcher based out of India, Kerala specifically, which is in South India. So this event is particularly meaningful for me to be a part of today. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen, and I will take you through the agenda that we have planned for the day. Let me know if you can see my screen. I hope you can also see my screen, yes? Okay, great. So just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Please remember to mute your microphone when you're not speaking, and also feel free to turn off your camera if it's affecting your connection at all. We would love to see your face if you ask a question, if you're speaking. So if possible, we'd love to have you turn it on when you are speaking, but if not, we completely understand. We know that data is, is giving us a lot, gives us all a lot of trouble, especially, when it comes to opportune moments sometimes, so no worries. So I'll quickly take you through the agenda that we have planned for today. We will begin with Stephen Leonard from the Climate Justice Program Indonesia, followed by Neptano from the ETC Group Philippines. After this, we'll have like a 15-minute Q&A session, after which we'll play a game of trivia. This is so that we all get to participate and all get to learn about false climate solutions in an interactive way. So we'll have a trivia in which we will show you the leaderboard of who's come first and who's got more answers right. So we'd love for all of you to join in, and you can play this game really directly from your laptops or your mobile phones. Also, it doesn't matter what device you're joining us from, you will be able to play this game. We'll give you all the links in the chat box. So we'd love for you to play with us. Then we'll have a brief break, after which we will come back for the next two speakers, right? So we'll come back to listen to Titi Soentoro from Indonesia and Pasang Sherpa from Nepal, following which we'll again have a brief Q&A session. And if we have time, we will play another round of trivia. But if it looks like there's a lot of really interesting discussion going on, we're happy to have that continue as well. So we'd really like to hear from all of you. So that is what we have plan for the day. Okay, so so I'd like to begin by establishing like the criticality of the issues that we're here to discuss today, right? So the world, really as we know it, is very much at an ecological precipice, and we have to urgently reduce our emissions by at least half, right, to survive the looming threat of 1.5 degrees, reaching 1.5 degrees. Fall solutions, which we're here to learn about today, broadly are solutions that not only do they not really address the problem at hand substantially, but often deceive people into believing that that it is making a difference. At the same time, these false solutions trigger other serious problems, often exacerbating climate change and other ecological problems. And most importantly, and most dangerously, what these false solutions do is that they displace or replace real people-first solutions to the climate change crisis. So to help us understand this topic today, we have 4 stellar speakers that I just introduced who are going to speak to us. And we will guide you through, like I said, we'll guide you through the game of trivia and everything. And we'd love to have all of you play. A quick reminder to our distinguished speakers today that each of you will have the floor for about 12 to 14 minutes, and I'll remind you via chat when you have a couple of minutes left to go. And we'd be very grateful if you could be mindful of time, since we really would love to have a good discussion and an open Q&A with all the fantastic people who are lovely people who are introducing themselves via chat. So having said that, this webinar has really been conceived of as a great entry point to understanding this incredibly complex topic. But at the same time, having been lucky enough to see the presentations of the speakers slightly ahead of time before most of you, I dare say that there is plenty here, even for people who are already familiar with this topic, to learn. So we have a really nuanced discussion planned for the day. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the first speaker for the day, Stephen. Oh wait, quickly, before we get to Stephen, I have a quick request for all of you. Before we get started, would you like to play? Would you like to join a Mentimeter with all of us? Would you like to respond before we get started on this webinar on what you think false climate solutions really are? Corina's very helpfully given us the link there in the chat box. I hope all of you are able to access it. If you click on the link, it should take you to a Mentimeter page, which asks you to name 3 false climate solutions that come to mind. So we would love for all of you to click on that and respond, and we will look at the results. Corina will take us to the results after Stephen's spoken. So if you could do that now, that would be fantastic. The link is there again in the chat box. Okay. Right, now back to Stephen. So Stephen, we're very, very lucky and excited to have you here today. Stephen Leonard is an international lawyer specializing in climate change, human rights, and biodiversity. He's the president of the Climate Justice Program in Australia and has been based in Indonesia for about 8 years now. He has a long history of work on climate litigation, supporting indigenous movements and rights-based approaches in strategy development, research, writing, and advocacy for a range of non-governmental organizations. More recently, he has established a new global international law and policy group, the RA Group, which is providing strategic support to a range of organizations, including civil society, foundations, UN agencies, and the government. So yeah, Stephen, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Yatira, and it's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'll just share my screen here, and it's nice to be on this panel with Neth and Titi and Pasang, and so yeah, it's nice to be here. So we have limited time, so I'll get straight into it. So maybe before we talk about false solutions, let's just quickly remind ourselves what we actually do need to do. So this is not specific in terms of deadlines and dates and things, but we need to be phasing out fossil fuels as a top priority. We need to be keeping oil and gas in the ground, going 100% renewable. We need to be recognising rights of Indigenous peoples, rights-based approaches, scale-up support for smallholders. So these are the things that need to happen. So when we're thinking about false solutions and what they don't do, it's pretty much in this list. And so when it gets into the question around what false solutions are, there's no sort of agreed definition on this across movements. But from having a look at a few, I like this one that I found in the International Rights of Nature Tribunal paper that I was having a look at, which is solutions that pretend to address the key issues while in reality only perpetuating the unsustainable status quo and even worsening solutions, or worse solutions that may affect and violate even more of nature's rights. So I think that's a nice definition there. But then, as looking through a number of different sort of bits and pieces of information out there, I identified a few sort of elements that we might want to think about in terms of what false solutions are. And so, they often represent the interests of the sort of large industrial complex, so fossil fuel companies, agribusiness, and they often represent the interests of those who are causing the problem. They often perpetuate biodiversity destruction, climate change and erosion of people's rights, especially those of vulnerable people. And they often result in the displacement of or loss of Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights. False solutions are often also essentially sort of covered up in some ways by certification schemes and standards that are out there, claiming to be sustainable, and essentially they don't address the root causes of climate change. So I think it's not necessary to really define what they are. I mean, defining things can sometimes put sort of limitations on things, but I think it's nice to identify a few different elements of some of these concepts. In terms of where we're going these days, I just wanted to also mention, I guess, the relationship between false solutions and greenwashing. We're seeing a real rise in greenwashing. I often sort of refer to this as the sort of entering the age of greenwash. Although greenwash has been around, the CJP actually did some work on greenwashing on carbon neutrality all the way back in 2009 and raised this issue in one of the legal sort of channels in Australia concerning sort of misleading and deceptive conduct claims around carbon neutrality. So this has been around for a long time, this approach to misleading conduct on the part of companies to be claiming to be sort of so-called, in inverted commas, green. But I also found this one interesting as well. And all these sort of references that I point to, I provide some links at the end of this presentation. I'll share this presentation afterwards, and so people can go to some of these links. But I found an interesting one here, the Client Earth taking a case. I've been doing a lot of work on climate-related litigation in my legal capacity, but there's a case against KLM, the airline, which is challenging offsetting and looking at unlawfulness of and misleading and deceptive conduct of airlines, which I'm sure we'll touch on a few times in this conversation. But today I'll be talking mostly about 4 areas of false solutions, and others here will be speaking about other areas, but I'll be touching on net zero as well as these, I guess, 3 subcategories of false solutions around bioenergy, plantations, offsetting and carbon trading. So just quickly around net zero or fake zero, because net zero is not zero. And we know that there are campaigns out there. Many of us are probably familiar with the campaign seeking real zero, but net zero is not zero, although it's often sort of portrayed as being zero, but it's not. It's a balancing out. It's essentially an offsetting type of an approach. And this comes from Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. So this was something that I was I was involved in trying to push back against this, along with a number of other people in Paris and in the lead up to Paris. But unfortunately, this one made it through because it did have a lot of support from a lot of the large non-governmental organisations and UN agencies and the like. But this is this notion of achieving a balance between emissions by sources and removals by sinks, and so that basically is the net. That's the netting out, and then it sets out that second half of the century. So this is where net zero essentially comes from. So in terms of what we're seeing with net zero, we're seeing a huge rise in corporate commitments and pledges. But it's essential that we start putting boundaries and parameters on what this actually means, because it's a bit, it's not really that well defined. There are some initiatives out there that are doing that. But what it does is it's giving a false sense that we can simply balance out the increasing emissions with carbon dioxide removal, and most of that is being discussed in the context of nature and through initiatives around restoration. A number of problems come up with this, especially in the context of nature. Removals may become reversals, so they're not permanent. As we know, forests burn, ecosystems degrade, especially in a warmer world. And so those removals become what's called reversals, and those emissions go back into the atmosphere. It creates there's a false equivalence between nature and fossil fuels because of this reason. Emissions reductions in fossil fuels or changing of infrastructure can actually be permanent, whereas we don't have the permanence with nature. There are limitations on land. There are a lot of pledges out there, and I'm involved in another study at the moment, which is identifying that there's more land required, or there's more land that would be required in terms of the net zero pledges than what's actually available on the planet. So there's a problem there. It really limits the notion or the approach to nature as being something there to store carbon, whereas there's much more to it. A lot of people rely, so Indigenous peoples, for example, rely on nature, and then of course there's the biodiversity component of it. And then there's this notion, I think it's too late to really be thinking much about offsetting it all. We're running out of room in the carbon budget. I think the days of being able to think seriously about offsetting it are probably over by now. And then getting to bioenergy.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you're going really fast. If you could please slow down for a lot of us in the room. Okay.
I'm trying to finish my slides in time. I'll slow down. So turning to nature and these three subcategories of false solutions. In terms of nature, bioenergy is the first one. So essentially this is thinking along the lines of using trees in a similar way to coal. There's a high reliance. So this is sort of feeding the plantation or the approach to plantations. A lot of biofuels or biomass is coming from plantations, and so it's putting more stresses and impacts on land. There's the impacts on smallholder farmers, squeezing smallholder farmers out. So there's an industrial approach that's being taken to bioenergy. And there's a much more energy that's needed through burning wood and it doesn't actually create that much energy. So there's a lot of wood that's needed in order to replace the energy that is generated through, for example, coal or renewables. It's also highly emissive. When we get into the bioenergy discussion, there's an international market around bioenergy, and so it actually results in it potentially being more emissive than coal when you start to add it all up and look at the shipping, the global shipping especially. And it moves finance away from where it really should be going into, example, renewables and diverts attention away from actually phasing out fossil fuels. In Indonesia, for example, there's a lot, and in other countries, there's a lot of discussion about continued use of coal plants and refurbishing coal plants to be partly coal and partly bioenergy. So it essentially keeps that infrastructure in place. So there's a number of issues there with bioenergy. When it comes to plantations, as many of us will know, there's a sort of myth of sustainable forestry that's out there, and the definition of forests. The definition of forests based on the FAO definition can include plantations. And so this is problematic, but sustainable forestry has been around for a long time, yet we still see a huge amount of deforestation. So serious questions as to whether or not this is working. There's claims of carbon storage potential in plantations, although it's very, very minimal. Essentially this approach to reforestation and nature-based solutions is a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing. We hear a lot about the benefits of planting trees and restoration and nature-based solutions, but a lot of this does lead in the direction of monoculture plantations. And so the devil is very much in the detail, and this then links to the greenwashing. Whenever we hear or see people talking about tree planting initiatives, it's worth having a look behind, or restoration initiatives. It's always worthwhile having a look at what's actually happening on the ground. But most importantly, I think, is that science shows that there's very little or to no mitigation potential of plantations when it's compared to other approaches such as protection of natural ecosystems and restoration of natural ecosystems. And then we get to offsetting and carbon trading. I just wanted to just mention a couple of myths here that we hear around the place to justify the approach to offsetting and carbon trading in terms of forests. One myth is that forest carbon markets are needed to raise finance for conservation, although the big NGOs use this as a basis for their arguments in favour of offsetting and carbon trading to generate finance for conservation. And then there's another myth out there that there's not enough public money available, and so we need to bring the private sector in. We need the markets to be stepping in order to be providing the sort of money that's needed. But when we look at it, I mean, the money, to bust this myth, the reality is that the money is there. For example, US military spending is at over 700 billion a year at the moment. So the money is out there. This is really a question of political will. It's not an issue of a lack of money. But the issues with offsetting and carbon trading are quite technical. To some it looks good on the sort of outside, but the devil is very much in the detail. Again, going back to the permanence point that I'd mentioned before, nature offsets not permanent. What they're doing in order to deal with the reversals question is creating what they're calling buffers. And so they're creating what these pools of buffers. So if there's a certain amount of emissions reduction, a percentage of those go into a global buffer. But these are untested in terms of what we might see with, for example, increased temperature scenarios. So we don't really know if these buffers are going to work. But this is very much used as a basis for the claims of high integrity carbon credits. Double counting continues to be a problem, which is where claimed emissions reductions are counted more than once, which is very misleading and inaccurate. Not additional. This is a challenge, especially for remote communities. Not providing benefits, so it's very sort of serving corporate interests and government interests. This discussion around benefits for Indigenous communities and smallholders around carbon trading has been going on for a very long time without seeing really much in the way of benefit sharing or benefits going to Indigenous communities, and it can result in carbon grabs. So the access to carbon for communities is either very unclear, or the rights are being assigned to governments, so that the rights to the carbon to governments over the communities. It's a difficult concept to understand. It's very technical, so that then creates a barrier of entry, and there's a lack of governance in the space as well, with different markets, different alignment in terms of different approaches. So it's very confusing. In terms of the current market at the moment around offsetting, there is a huge increase happening at the moment from the corporate sector. A lot of people have invested a lot of money in carbon markets, and so people are hoping for payday to be just around the corner, and we're seeing a sort of an oversupply of hot air, so dodgy sort of credits coming through. The aviation sector is one. We're seeing a lot of discussion around high integrity, what people are calling high integrity carbon credits, which is a bit of a false dichotomy, really. But there's this constant effort to increase the integrity to make them more sellable, and there are a number of ways that that's being done. So as Shatit mentioned at the beginning, the impact of false solutions is that it slows progress. It creates a feeling that things are happening when they're actually not. And there are serious impacts on vulnerable people and people in the global south coming through on this. In terms of the global decision-making space around false solutions, especially carbon trading, this is coming up very much in the UNFCCC, the UN Framework on Climate space. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, many would have heard of. The rule book to Article 6 was agreed last year in Glasgow. And just that bottom box there just identifies a few bullets there. All of those challenges, those complex challenges that I'd mentioned before on offsetting, they all remain. None of that has really been resolved as a result of the Article 6 negotiations. But in addition to that, we also have serious challenges in terms of participation. There's a weak grievance redress mechanism in place as well, which is another major problem or another major flaw. But one of the big issues there is it shifts the burden of emissions reductions and mitigation to the global south, and that shouldn't be happening. Just wanted to mention here why false solutions are very difficult to challenge. One reason is a communications issue. It's a bit of a negative framing, and people find positive messaging to be a bit more digestible. But I think these other two are perhaps more important. When people are seeking quick fixes and immediate fixes. And so net zero has the support of big NGOs, business, UN, techno fixes like geoengineering, which Neth will speak about, potentially popular to people who are into techno fixes, and again, offsetting. It's seen as an easy way out. It's a quick fix for people, so it's quite appealing to people who don't really want to do much. But another reason is that false solutions don't really challenge the power base. They don't look at any system change. Essentially, false solutions are supported by the power base, so they have a lot of support from the fossil fuel industry. A lot of support from government and the UN, and it's very much a sort of a dominant sort of colonial type narrative that's entrenched in sort of Western white supremacy and racial injustice as well. So in terms of countering that narrative, it's worthwhile thinking about a few ways forward here. So looking at protection rather than sort of quick fixes or offsetting ways out. So highlighting the importance of protection and of natural forests and restoration of natural ecosystems over, for example, plantations. More work on recognising rights of Indigenous peoples and making sure that that rights-based approaches are very much highlighted when talking about solutions for climate change. And there needs to be more emphasis on needs. So the mitigation focus, the sort of net zero, offsetting, REDD+, all these things have very much a mitigation focus. This is not a need of many communities in the global south. Adaptation is more of a need, or supporting compensation for impacts. So thinking about sort of flipping the narrative there away from mitigation and thinking more about needs-based adaptation. And then the other one I just wanted to highlight here is to put a bit more emphasis on the real solutions. And I've just highlighted here the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which many of us would be familiar with. And so thinking about the real solutions that are out there, or the real initiatives that are out there that are focusing on focusing on those points that I'd mentioned in the first slide there. So phasing out fossil fuels, achieving 100% renewables, and really getting to the issues rather than sort of skirting around it. So as I'd mentioned, there's a bunch of references here. So I've got 2 slides with a bunch of links. So when this is shared, feel free to jump in and have a look at some of the links that are here. And with that, I will finish and hand it over back over to you, Chititra.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you for finishing what is actually really was a wealth of information in such a like a magic bullet, a little capsule. So thank you so much. And I think people would love to have the opportunity to ask questions and clarify any doubts as we move forward. I particularly love what you said about how it is important to remember that there is a tremendous support for false solutions from the seats of power, whether it's transnational corporations or UN agencies, governments, and so on. And like you said, it is important to remember that with many of these false solutions, the devil is in the details, right? Which is why it's absolutely critical that there is more awareness and transparency built around this. Great, thank you so much, Stephen, and we will definitely be hearing more from you in the Q&A. Next, before we head over to Neth, I would like to go to Corina to look at the results of the Menti-Beta. So Corina, could you tell us what the people have said?
Yeah, I think you can see my screen now, right? Let me make it bigger. So yeah, thanks for voting. We got a lot of responses, and actually, yeah, it is great to see that a lot of the false climate solutions that people mentioned, Stephen talked about them, but also the next panelists are going to get more into detail, like about geoengineering and others. So I think we all have more or less the same understanding of what these false climate solutions might look like. So yeah, this is the screen.
Thank you, Corina. And yes, in fact, that giant word there, geoengineering, right there in the middle in red, is really something that is what we're going to hear about next. So Neth Dano, we're so happy to have you here. Neth is the Asia Director and Coordinator of the Action Group on Erosion, Technology and Concentration, the ETC Group, based in Southern Philippines. ETC Group is an international civil society organization that monitors the impacts of new and emerging technologies on marginalized communities, tracks corporate concentration and governance in food and agriculture, and investigates erosion of biodiversity. So yes, Neth, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the Global Forest Coalition for organizing this and for inviting etc. group to contribute to the discussions. I was actually requested to focus my presentation on carbon dioxide removal, which is a suite of technologies that are part of geoengineering. I will try to make the presentation as simple and less techy as possible, and I'll try to stick to time. 13 minutes, I think. Okay, so what are carbon dioxide removals? I think Steve has also alluded to this, mentioned it a few times during this presentation. Let's go to the first slide, please. Just to define what CDR is. These are actually geoengineering technologies that aim to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere after those greenhouse gases have been emitted. From the definition alone, it's very clear that removals is not mitigation, because mitigation by definition is actually reduction or prevention of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is not actually preventing or even reducing, but really allowing greenhouse gases to be emitted to the atmosphere and then remove them once they're there. And as I was listening to Steve's elements of what makes fall solutions, it's really very clear, that CDR and geoengineering as a whole fits to the T, the definition of fall solutions. This does not address the root cause of the problem. This does not address at all the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This definitely does not address inequity, does not address the nipping the bud in terms of stopping fossil fuel use. And I was just reminded about when Steve said that these are solutions that are supported by power. I was just reminded by a recent article that came out in one of the energy newsletters, quoting the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of ExxonMobil, saying that CDR, carbon removals, he considers them as the holy grail of all the technologies that address climate change. He said that that CDR are actually climate cure with oil perks. That's how he described it. These are climate cure with oil perks. So that means that it's not intended to stop the use of fossil fuel, but addresses the symptoms, which is greenhouse gas, letting them use it and continuously emit that, and they have this magical quote unquote technology that will remove those greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So I will go through some examples. I focus on 3 just to illustrate this clearly. Next, please. Before I go into this slide, I'll just emphasize what I said earlier, that removals is not mitigation. I have to emphasize, underline, put it in bold, because like attending the recent subsidiary body meetings of the UNFCCC in Bonn, we were actually horrified that there's a lot of switching of terms between mitigation and removals, even in the negotiation room, on the global stocktake, when they discussed technologies and mitigation, they were switching between removals and mitigation. Also, even in that whole discussion on addressing the other issues that are related to mitigation. So as I mentioned earlier, CDR, or carbon dioxide removal, is part of the whole suite of technologies called geoengineering. There are many other technologies in that suite, which are categorized into solar radiation management, and also carbon dioxide removals, which I will focus this discussion on. And just to emphasize, in this bleak infographic, that these technologies are actually being experimented on land, terrestrial ecosystems, in oceans, and also in the atmosphere. Many of them are actually being piloted and tested in the open environment in blatant violation of the Convention on Biodiversity's prohibition on deployment of geoengineering. I'll discuss that later. Next slide, please. I will focus the examples of CDR on three big technologies that are receiving a lot of investments coming from fossil fuel interest and also some governments. First is direct air capture. There's a lot of hoopla, of noise about the promises of these technologies, and a lot of investments also going that way. In fact, one of the companies that were established with money from fossil fuel industry, Climeworks, actually already has a pilot project in Switzerland. And these ugly machines that you see in the picture are examples of direct air capture. Earlier on in the discussions on geoengineering, some of these machines, they call them artificial trees, which is an insult to what tree is. So the intent of this machine is actually to suck out carbon or particular greenhouse gases such as methane from the atmosphere. They are very, very energy intensive. The energy required for sucking and also for storing in geological formation, generally underground, takes up a lot of energy. Next, please. Apart from direct air capture, there's also carbon capture and storage, and newer terms such as CCUS, which you will also hear abundantly, even in the halls of negotiations in the UNFCCC and even in the IPCC. CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage, which actually proposes several ways to use that captured carbon, such as developing products like cement and asphalt and other materials to store that captured carbon instead of storing them in geological formations. In terms of CCS, about 85% of all CCS that exist in small scale, particularly attached to coal mines, are actually, and also old oil wells, are actually meant for enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, and promoted by the oil industry to access deep oil reserves and extract more oil from spent and old wells. Next, please. So as I mentioned, about 85% of all CCS are actually meant as EOR, which will increase greenhouse gas emission. Contrary to the claims that it will actually address greenhouse gas emission, the more they press, the more they claim of capture, the more they extract and burn, which actually increases greenhouse gas emission. In terms of full life cycle analysis, CCS actually presents a wrong energy balance. There's actually more emissions. There are tons of studies that show this, which are also even presented in the assessment reports of the IPCC since AR4, in fact. As I mentioned, it perpetuates the fossil fuel industry, and already some of the new installations in the US, for example, are already impacting communities. And studies also show that there's not enough grounds to actually have the sufficient number of CCS to be able to address the greenhouse gas emissions that are already up in the air, and it will actually exacerbate land grabbing. And CCUS is just a matter of postponing the re-emission of greenhouse gases. And as I mentioned earlier, DAC, or the direct air capture, is extremely expensive, energy demanding, and promotes other dirty energies such as nuclear. And it could also compete on renewables and public subsidies, as already happening in the US now. Next, please. Another example is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Many of you know this, and it's important to understand that bioenergy here in BBX, in BEX, actually twins with carbon capture and storage, which I mentioned earlier. So you burn biomass, capture the carbon dioxide, and then store it in geological formation. There is an example in the US and also in the UK, which are being touted as big, huge, but haven't really shown concrete outcomes in terms of mitigation, because it's not really mitigation. Removal is not mitigation. Next, please. For BECS, in terms of potential impacts, there are claims about co-benefits to the environment and people's livelihoods, but in reality, it would actually involve growing monocrops on vast areas that will centralize bioenergy production, would have devastating impacts on land, water, and biodiversity. It would compete with food production. It would, of course, increase demand for fertilizers and agrochemicals, and would adversely impact farming and forest economies, and of course, impact on control over ownership of and competition for land and other productive resources. All of this were actually recognized by the IPCC in AR5 and also AR6. Next, please. Will BECS fix the climate crisis? Definitely no. There are a lot of debates about the emissions from converting land to energy production that could result in displacement of food. It could result to degradation and overharvesting of forest. Also, emission from soils, disturbance in agricultural mechanization and transport will be part of the BECS equation. Will also create new demands for biomass, which could further degrade natural terrestrial sinks. Next, please. A third example that I'd like to highlight for CDR is ocean fertilization. At ETC, we've followed cases upon cases of ocean fertilization since 2007, 2008. And at one point, we thought that this is a dead technology. This has been lambasted left and right by many credible scientists and scientific institutions, but lo and behold, we've actually a resurgence of ocean fertilization hoopla noises in the past 2 years. Even in the halls of the UNFCCC, during the workshop on oceans, there were actually a few mentions on the potentials of ocean fertilization. Next, please. Ocean fertilization is largely the dumping of some particular materials such as iron sulfates and nitrogen to encourage the growth of phytoplanktons and algae that are meant to suck carbon from the atmosphere and bury that carbon in the seabed or ocean bed, so theoretically. But studies have shown that ocean fertilization examples and cases in thousands of hectares, acres of oceans, particularly international waters, have actually shown disturbance of marine food web, that it could also worsen ocean acidification. It's been identified as a culprit for production of toxic algal blooms. It could also result to hypoxia over production of oxygen or no production of oxygen in deeper layers of the ocean, could produce harmful gases, and yes, it could lead to commercial most, if not all, of ocean fertilization examples have actually been connected to commercial interests that actually want to take advantage of the carbon markets. Next, please. I'll try to fasten up to fast track this. I've actually reached my time. CDR in general is a waste of precious time at a time when we all have to put our hands and heads together to be able to respond to the urgent crisis that we're facing, climate crisis that we're facing. All of these proposals, along with the rest of geoengineering, is actually a waste of the little time that we have. They will not help in addressing overshoot. These are just mainly speculative and conceptual, and all of them are actually not proven technologies. They are mainly being used as an excuse to not reduce and continue emitting while compensating, offsetting, removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere while continuing burning. All these techno fixes demand massive investments on R&D, as I mentioned earlier. That's why you have all these fossil fuel backers behind many of these direct air capture and CCS examples. And yes, it's a new way to perpetuate an unjust world order. Next, please. And as in the title of my presentation, these are all dangerous distractions. While the climate crisis is real, taking place alongside many other crises, you have false solutions such as CDR and solar management, engineering as a whole that are wasting our time. We need to change both at the national and international level, starting from the knowledge and experience of grassroots and urban communities, small farmers, and indigenous peoples. None of this, next please, none of these techniques would actually address the root causes of climate change, and the drivers of climate change and environmental justice would continue. And next please. So I think I'll have to skip this other slide. These are like why geoengineering is so dangerous. Many of this I mentioned. Next please. I have to also, next slide please. I have to emphasize that when we say geoengineering or CDR, it's not that we are only opposing the deployment or commercial deployment themselves, but also the experiments which are actually happening in the real world, that therefore impacting the real world. As I mentioned, ocean fertilization in thousands of hectares of oceans in international waters have been happening from 2 decades now, and they're really impacting the real world without regulation and without the benefit of oversight at all. And this is dangerous since there's rarely any science involved in those experiments, but often hardware development explorations, and they tend to lock us in those technological pathways. And they cannot give meaningful information about the geoscale impacts of these experiments. Last slide, or second to the last slide, next please. I have to remind us that all of these experiments are happening while there is an ongoing moratoria on geoengineering. In 2008, the Convention on Biodiversity actually adopted a moratorium on ocean fertilization, which rolled into further discussions in the London Protocol and London Convention that took a decision in 2013 to ban all ocean fertilization, all geoengineering experiments actually. In 2010, the CBD also adopted a soft moratorium on all geoengineering techniques except CCS for political reasons. Therefore, all of this, because of all this risk and unfairness, we need to enforce this ban. Largely on campaign, there is an umbrella campaign called the Hands Off Mother Earth that actually started in 2009, which we relaunched 5 years ago, now involving over 200 civil society organizations that are actually working towards raising awareness on all these issues on CDR and geoengineering, and denounces geoengineering and demand an immediate stop to all open air experiments. So I end my presentation there, and sorry for overshooting my time. I hope that was useful. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ned. I appreciate that one slide, which was emphatic in saying that none of the geoengineering techniques address the root cause of climate change. And that I think that's really important for us to remember and reiterate. Great. So thank you again. And at this point, I would like to, Sasha just said in the chat that, amazing, learning so much. I agree. I feel the same way. And I want to throw the floor open for questions at this point. If you'd like to put your hand up, I can call on you. If you'd prefer to put a question in the chat, I can read that out for you as well. So depending on what you prefer, go ahead. And I see a hand up already. So please,
Suparna, go ahead. Yeah, thank you, Chitira. Two great presentations from both Steve and Neth, as usual. This is mainly to Steve. Just want to know, you have used the word removers in your slide, and Neth was just referring to removers in the CDR presentation. So like to know, what do you mean when you say removers with reference to the land sector, forest especially? This is number one. And you gave a reference to Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement, which sets up a false equivalence, as you say, between anthropogenic emissions and removers. Now, what is wrong with that, which from which net zero is a spin-off? And also two other clarifications as what do you mean when you say permanence in terms of forest and land sector and additionality? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Sapana. Okay, so right into terminology here. So it's all questions around words. So when we talk about removals, the word removals is a word that is used throughout the UN policy framework. It comes up it's there mentioned in Article 4. It comes up in a number of other articles. It's one of the big questions that's outstanding in relation to the new sort of carbon market that they're putting in place in relation to Article 6. And so I'd mentioned Article 6, which is the paragraph of the Paris Agreement, which puts in place this new carbon trading system. And they agreed on the, as I mentioned, they agreed on the rules for this back in Glasgow. It's been, in terms of the land sector, removals has been essentially understood to be sequestration. So as forest trees sequester carbon, and so it's essentially removing carbon. But it's going through a bit of a process at the moment in the Article 6 discussions, where there's an effort to really unpack what would be included in this terminology around removals. And I do agree with what Neth had said about removals not being mitigation. And I think that this is a really strong argument in terms of it's removing. It's sort of after the fact. It's a reactive sort of an approach to something that's already happened. It's not mitigating the problem of emissions entering the atmosphere. And the discussion concerning removals that's coming up at the moment in the UN climate space is extremely broad and extremely worrying, and includes a whole list of different potential activities that could fall within the category of removals, which are a whole list of things that have been mentioned here today as problematic and as false solutions, including a lot of the geoengineering approaches. On Article 6, on Article 4, the problem with the wording there is that it's just too broad. The understanding of what this there's no real sort of guidance in terms of what this balancing out means. And so, if emissions, it could be understood to mean if emissions continue to just increase and increase and increase, then we just have to implement all these just carbon dioxide removal approaches, and then try to find that balance somehow. But that's not realistic. There needs to be very clear parameters on how this could be done. So, the problem there with that wording, in my view, is that it's just too broad. Permanence or non-permanence is usually how it's referred to. Non-permanence is exactly what it means. The emissions reductions are not permanent. There's no way of guaranteeing that those emissions reductions will remain as emissions reductions. And so if there's a fire, for example, which is highly likely in a warmer world, I mean, if we look at the current nationally determined contributions that are on by countries under the Paris Agreement, it puts the world on almost 3-degree trajectory, which in that case, all your forest-based carbon projects would go up in flames. And so even the most generous buffer wouldn't accommodate for what we currently have in front of us concerning the NDCs. In terms of additionality, this is also a bit of a tricky one. To meet the criteria and for carbon trading, it has to meet the additionality criteria, which means that the activity has to be sort of over and above what would have otherwise have happened had the project not being implemented for the purposes of climate change. So I think the remote communities example is a good way to put it in the context of the land sector. If there's a forest concession in place and a forest hasn't yet been deforested, then it could be said that the carbon project or the project there to prevent that deforestation is perhaps additional. But if there's no concession in place, it's a very rural community and there's no indication or no thinking that from the part of the government that area would be deforested at any point in time, and essentially the forest is fairly safe and secure, although all forests are probably under threat if you ask me, regardless. But if it's very remote likelihood of the forest being lost, then it would be more difficult to argue that the activity is additional. So I'm not sure if we want to get into more detail about that, but yeah, I hope that clarifies on those points.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for clarifying that. Net, did you have your hand up there for a bit, or?
No, it was yes there, but Stephen has already mentioned what I wanted to say. But maybe I should just take this opportunity to inform colleagues that we are not just discussing here of possibilities of removals entering the 6.4 Article 6.4 mechanism. Like the recent meeting of the supervisory body of Article 6 has actually considered a paper that actually takes into account different removals activities, and it's actually focusing on CDR. Exactly what we're discussing here will enter this Article 6.4 mechanism. The points that were explained by Steve earlier on leakage, permanence, and all that are things that they are focusing their attention on, that needs to be addressed, but it seems to be a foregone conclusion that removal CDR will actually enter the 6.4 mechanism. I think we also have to discuss that in some spaces in terms of strategies and how to address those. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Nat. Yes, absolutely. We also have a question for the both of you in the chat from Nazira. Hi, Stephen and Nat. Thanks for the insightful sharing. I have a question on what are the corporations expected to do now, since we understand that all of the efforts they do, like Net Zero Roadmap, NBS, and CCS, are only a bunch of false solutions. Thanks. Would either of you like to take that question?
Is Nazira asking us to advise corporations what to do? Did I get the question right? Yeah, I think my main advice is to get out of our way, get lost. So that's my main advice, because I think it's not just out of frustration, but you actually see this very, very concretely, that they are in the way. Like even in the UN, for example, you're not just talking of the UNFCCC, you're talking of other spaces like FAO, FAO, New York, and all that. They're all there, like really pushing for multi-stakeholderism as a part of the package of false solution, promoting themselves as part of the solution, and corrupting those spaces, and even robbing us of those spaces and also our language. Like they have actually expropriated many of our language. Now you are actually treading on very careful grounds now, mentioning even agroecology. You have corporations even saying that they are promoting agroecology, and you'll make you think like there must be something wrong with that concept now, that you hear Syngenta promoting agroecology. So like me, if there's an advice, and I think if there's a move that we have to do, is for them to get out of our way. You know, like I don't know what the comment of that went there, that yes, it's wrong. I don't know. Sorry, I get distracted. I think it's another point. Sorry.
Yeah, that was a different question. Love that response. Yes, love that. Yes, please get out of our way. Indeed, that was another question in the chat, is what do the supporters of techno-fix solutions and offsetting answer when we present to them our critiques and a demonstration of the inefficiency of those solutions? Would either of you like to respond? Yeah.
Maybe I can go back to those two myths. I mean, Netha probably have a different answer on this, but it may be similar in terms of the work that she's done on geoengineering. But you know, when it comes to the land sector, you know, a lot of the responses are essentially, well, you know, where's the money going to come from? We need the money. We need to, you know, we need to restore natural ecosystems. We need to protect forests. All of this stuff costs money. Where's the money going to come from then, if it's not going to come from a carbon market? And so there's this, which I consider to be a myth, because I think that the money is out there. And then there's another myth around the need for the private sector. Let's not forget that the private sector has essentially been responsible for all of the issues. And when we start talking about private sector in the land sector being a part of the solution, if we were to put aside, I guess, sort of small to medium enterprises that are also private sector, and think about the big companies that are out there, we're talking about them also being a part of the solution. And so, I mean, how many would want the arsonist to also be the firefighter? You know, it's a bit like that. You know, and so there's a challenge there in terms of the, you know, how is this funded? And so essentially a question, from as far as I can tell, and I've been watching this for a very long time, it's very much a question around money, and where the money comes from. And I think that it's a real myth that we need private sector in there to be protecting forests and to be engaging in ecosystem restoration. Sure, we need money, but I think that the countries around the world do have enough money to provide that sort of support, but they just don't prioritize it.
Just to add to what Steve said, I fully support that response. I think also another myth that's being promoted, whenever we present our critique, is that in CDR they would say that they are not really promoting CDR as the solution, but just to complement real mitigation, which is deep cuts and all that. But then we have to interrogate that myth. Because the reality is that resources, funds from the private sector are going into these false solutions, and governments are also going along. And I think we have to always interrogate insistence that they are not really pushing for just false solutions or techno fixes, but are really wanting to have or to promote genuine solutions such as deep cuts. Because in reality, where the political will and also funds go is an indication of where the priorities are. So just to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Neth. I see that we have several questions and comments in the chat. I'm going to quickly read them out, and but then I'm also mindful of time, so I'm going to take one more question. I can see that a lot of people have so much to say about this. So quick comments from Nikki saying, in Africa, the narrative on CDR being popularized is that it is an injustice not to do CDR in the region because it will provide a livelihood to people. There are organizations speaking about this in international conferences, webinars. Yes, that's good to know that there is that people are speaking about this. We have a question from Sasha who says to us to clarify, why is it so difficult to allocate funding to conservation and not reforestation? Is it because it is so difficult to demonstrate this additionally? And then who should receive these funds? Indigenous communities, right? I remember a case in Colombia, I believe, where the government wanted to get funds not to start oil drilling in the forest, but no one wanted to put money in the conservation of the forest. Yeah, absolutely. Anita says the technology that we are all using to interact, many of our organizations and our work is created and funded by these corporates. So I go back to Nazira's question, get out of the way on advocating for solutions. Yes, but what is the approach to real solutions adoption that can be encouraged? Also, we speak about renewables as a key solution. What about their material footprint, extraction and disposal? Right. Yes, I think we will get into more of these topics as we move to the next session as well. So thank you so much, Stephen and Neth. I hope you'll stick around for the next session as well. We are going to take a quick break because we've been here for about an hour, right? So let's take a quick 3-minute break and then we'll come back to play a game of trivia before moving to the next couple of speakers and then another Q&A. Right, so let's meet back here in 3 minutes and we will take it from there. Thank you so much, Rob. Right, shall we all begin to come back? All right, thank you. I see that Stephen and others are responding in the chat box as well to some of your questions, so feel free to keep adding your questions to the chat. So we can continue that conversation there. So shall we move on to the second part of today's sessions? Shall we go to our speakers first and then go to the trivia game? Because I think we have some fantastic, like really specialists in the field with us today. So I think it'll also be really good to give you all some time to interact with them as well. So let's go to the third speaker for the day. We have Titi with us. Titi Suentoro is a women's rights advocate who dedicates herself to mainstream women's rights and policy draftings and reviews related to environmental and social safeguards, information disclosure, consultation, and accountability mechanism of the international development and climate finance institutions. Moreover, she also capacitates grassroots women to the level that they can speak on behalf of themselves on the issues and problems they are encountering to the decision makers at the local and national level, and to defend their rights affected by massive development and climate projects. So Titi, take it away.
Thank you, Chitira, for the introduction, and also Global Forest Coalition to having me. And I would like to share my okay, I'm a bit nervous on this. Okay, so my presentation is related to the experience on the ground by women, grassroots women and indigenous women, related to the impacts of the false solutions. Okay, so what to do? Okay.
My name is Rusmini. I live with my family in Panambangan village on the foot of Mount Selamat in Central Java, Indonesia. Mount Selamat is a very fertile volcano and produces many water springs, rivers and streams, and waterfalls. We are living mainly from rice and cash crop farming, also from sweetwater fishery, particularly gourami and eels. Many villagers also earn their living from the local touristic destinations on the foot of Mount Selamat, which family in Panambangan village on the foot of Mount Selamat in Central Java, Indonesia. Mount Selamat is a very fertile volcano and produces many water springs, rivers and streams, and waterfalls. We are living mainly from rice and cash crop farming, also from sweetwater fishery, particularly gourami and eels. Many villagers also earn their living from the local touristic destinations on the foot of Mount Selamat, which are the waterfalls. One morning in November 2016, I was shocked to find brownies and muddy water came out from the water tap. I looked outside. Water streams through my village were also brownish colored and muddy. The whole village was alarmed. Then we found out that other villages experienced the same. We were confused, helpless, and restless to realize that we didn't have clean water anymore for drinking, cooking, washing, and bathing. After an investigation team was sent by the villagers up to the Mount Selamat, we got to know that a construction of infrastructure and drilling activities of a geothermal project was going on at the mountain slopes. Besides polluting water springs, rivers, and waterfalls for about 1 year, those activities also trigger loss of our community's livelihood and income. The river's biota was dead. Home businesses, including fish breedings and farming, and silkworm cultivation, were destroyed. The tofu home industries were forced to close down due to lack of clean water. Many people from my village were forced to look for other source of income. Taking debt from loan shark became a habit when we were no longer able to make ends meet. My household burden became heavier. When the water was muddy, besides the usual household chores, I had to walk until 2 kilometers to further away springs, waited in line for hours to get water. Then I had to carry heavy water buckets back and forth through steep, rocky, and wet soil paths. After fetching water, I had to do various works outside home to meet the family's economic needs. In February 2020, after 3 years, many families in my village still cannot recover from their livelihood and income loss, particularly due to lack of capital. The water flow rate of the rivers became low and cannot be the source anymore for river fish or for silkworms. Some tofu home industries run again, but have to pay additional costs for clean water. Many villagers now receive lower income from the alternative economic activities. Lives of the communities and particularly the women are still difficult. Women and girls bore the brunt of mud pollution into the rivers and streams caused by the geothermal project activities. Deprive us from clean water is a violence against us, the women and the girls.
So it was the story of women experience mud pollution during geothermal exploration, not even exploitation and constructions. So we brought this case to the to the pre-sessional working group on the 78th session of the CEDAW committee. And until now, we still advocate for this case, and the women of the village also start to educate another women's in the same area, not the same area, in the different area of the same mountains, because the company didn't find, the exploration was failed and didn't find a good place to exploit the geothermal, so they have to move and looking for another exploration sites. The second case is about the women from the Say Ahas against the Kalimantan Forest Carbon Partnership, which is one of the RADD plus demonstrations projects in Kalimantan. But this project is already terminated by the project owner in 2014. So the villages, you know, the project is about 120,000 hectares, and some villages were included in the project area, including the Say Ahas village and community. So the projects then close the community access to forests because they say it is the project area and they are not allowed to enter particular area of the forest. And a permanent dam was built and therefore hindered the community access to their fields and gardens, which is in the forest because it's their area. And those fields and gardens actually are their main livelihood. And the company, the projects also provide a complaint box if the community wants to complain, but the box was placed in the front of the house of the implementing entity team. So they are not there enough to go to the box and put their complaint because, you know, they feel it endangers their situations. So if we look at the women's situations, you know, so the women were having difficulties to find rattan that they use usually for making handicraft to sell to outside their village, and also medicinal plants in the forests. And they are also deprived from the community meetings if the community meets with the projects with the KFCP. So women involved only if they are in the position with the governments or represented if their husband or other family members cannot attend. And when they were in a meeting, they didn't speak much because they didn't understand what is being discussed. And the other experience of those women, for example, the promise payment of 100,000, the promised payment is not met, and they receive payment much less than promised, and also often very late. So then after years, the women of SEA has then organized themselves, supported by Solidaritas Perempuan, and then also they mobilize with other women and who experience the same situations. So they raise their situations of violation of their rights to KFCP, to local governments, national government, and also to the international level, as they heard that the projects would be extended, but luckily for them, the projects were terminated. So those are stories, or there are situations that show the implications of false solutions to the women on the grounds. And we see that those women's situations, that their situations, it is in the climate change. So climate change and the climate response measure is actually come to the people were already under the power, the intertwined power of patriarchy, globalization, militarism, and fundamentalism. So the climate change and then its response measure that turned out is a false solution for them, worsen the existing inequality and the living conditions of the people, particularly the women. If we look between men and women, so the ability to adapt to climate change in men and women are really dependent on access and control of our resources like income, natural resources, infrastructure, services, energy or water, as well also about knowledge on climate risk, on climate strategies that they can have to deal with the situations, and also depends on the available assistance. But in the situations under the patriarchy mindset, therefore women are more likely to be adversely affected by climate change than men, because not only they are the majority of the world poor, and their primary source of food and livelihood are threatened, and they also face discriminations, harmful stereotypes, and social, economic, political barriers that they limit their adaptive capacity. And also they have limited or unfair access to financial assets, services, informations, educations, land, resources, and decision-making processes. So they have less opportunity and less autonomy. So this condition created that women bore the brunt of climate change and climate response measures. And if we see the market-based solution offered to the governments, it's increased the situations of pressure under the globalization mindset and the patriarchy and the fundamentalism. And we see that the public and private climate financier prioritize low carbon or GHG solutions and ignores the environmental sustainability of the local and indigenous community. So one of the sign, or what the definition of false solution, I think, if there is a primacy on low carbon, but ignoring the sustainability of social, economic, and environmental situations of the community, particularly the women. And it is a false solution is also if they ignores the rights of the people to information, decision-making, water rights, and to healthy environment, and so on. So I was asked, so what is what's the call to deal with that? So we always tell to our counterpart and also our CSO colleagues and others that there will be no climate justice without gender justice. So it means if we fight for the climate justice, we need also to pay attention that of the situations of women who are under the gender injustices. So what we need is a transformative economy, which is, you know, not only about, you know, from the, you know, we want the economy, we have to transform from the extractive economy to more regenerative economy. And then the low carbon low carbon or greenhouse gases economy. So many times understood as a changing type of energy sources, but it is not true. We have to understand it differently, you know, and many times it is also understood as changing from high carbon to low carbon is changing the type of energy to clean energy project, which is not clean in the eyes of the community if it is about a destructive and massive projects. So the economic transformative and the transition to reduce GSG and strengthen the resilience against climate change must put primacy on the sustainability of livelihood and human and women's rights. So we need also to address inequalities within the economic system, and then recognize that the transition to the economy must have a gender equitable benefit. It should be also about the energy democracy, where the community will determine what kind of energy they need, really depending on their localities. It is also about care work, which should be recognized, reduced, and redistributed among the communities. Right now, care work is heavily put on the women's shoulders. So then to change the mindset of the care work, it's also needed for a just transition into climate and gender justice. And then lastly, the women wisdom and experience must be the base of decision in regard of any solution, any project's intervention, be it for climate, for development or investment projects. So that is some thought to contribute to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Titi. And yes, completely agree. You know, a low carbon economy must not just be about changing the type of resource. There should be a fundamental transformation which really focuses on the rights of the marginalized. Thank you so much for that powerful, powerful presentation and for that film. All of you can start putting questions to Titi in the chat. And in the meanwhile, we will move to our final speaker for the evening, Pasang. Pasang Sherpa, the Executive Director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development, who has been working with Indigenous peoples, women, and local communities for the recognition of their knowledge, cultural values, and customary institutions that contributed for sustainable management of forest, ecosystem, biodiversity, and climate resilience for more than a decade. She is currently the chair of the IUCN CSP Specialist Group on Indigenous Peoples' Customary and Environmental Laws and Human Rights. Yeah, we're very happy to have you here. Take it away, Pasang.
I'm just trying to see my notes, but I don't know where is it. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Chitira, and all friends and colleagues who are joining this important event. Once more, good afternoon, namaskar to everyone. This is my great pleasure to be part of this important event. And I really appreciate for your for welcoming to join this discussion on the important event. As we have already heard very important presentation from Stephen, Nath, and Titi. And I'm really glad that, connecting with the indigenous people issues and concerns in the climate change discourse, how it has been, moving a model of the full solution to deal with the climate crisis. It is also good to connect that the net zero is not the zero, and how we are creating an illusion with the geoengineering techniques that in the name of bigger solution to climate change, and definitely from the gender perspective is equally important. So I will be I do not have presentation, but I have a kind of draft notes for my session. So if you wish to get it, please have get it from the organizers. So demystifying actually the first solution to the climate change and its impacts is a really urgent and important topic for us to think about it, and for us to also reflect us back. Where are we heading into? We all are following the climate change discourse at the global level as well as at the national level, and we all are trying to change our behavior, and also trying to motivate others. But are we really moving ahead in the right direction? Whether we are following the same momentum at the business as usual and waste our energy and time. So this is the right time to think about it and also come to our discourse, and it is very timely in the beginning of the discussion going to be held in COP27 in Egypt. So I just would like to share my own story, in the discourse of the climate change in the past, maybe I think more than 18 years already that I have been following very closely. It is good that somehow there has been a little bit increasing in comparison to the 2008, 9, 10, like that. In the recent discourse in the climate change, especially in the UNFCCC, we have realized that there are little spaces being there for indigenous people or women or local communities to discuss on our issues and concerns. But when we see in the overarching framework of the climate change discourse, as discussed by Stephen and Nath and Titi also, that it looks as if the patterns of the discourse on climate change and solution remains the same. So what are we moving ahead? So this is a big question for all of us who are following the climate change discourse. If you see like in the global discourse, especially the negotiators, most of the relevant agencies, even the negotiator or parties, it looks like that they are still not sensitized, especially on the role of women and the role and contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities, especially how we have been contributed for natural resource governance and ecosystem biodiversity. In fact, so this is a really sad part for all of us, because the ground reality, as mentioned by Stephen, is not touched upon. It's just we are more discussing on the more superficial manners on the whole on the global levels, without touching the reality on the ground. Maybe you are already aware that if already come out with how 6.2 indigenous people world population is already contributing for 80% of the biodiversity. However, this outcome of the study is still not internalized by many policymakers or agencies, and especially what. Let me close my because I'm sorry, I'm in my work, so the colleagues are making some kind of. I could hear them. So this is also shows like that most of our agencies, so-called decision makers or policy makers, are still not aware the role and contribution of indigenous people for sustainability of the natural resources and contribution of the climate change resilience. And I totally agree with Stephen that all discussion at the global is really false solution, because you are more thinking driving all people like net zero, but in fact it's not real zero, and also not bringing the people on the ground. Then another, because I was the inaugural co-chair of the local communities and indigenous people platform of the UNCCC in the past 3 years, I'm still leading some of the activities within the UNCCC at the moment too. That the assessment that in the past 3 years when I was representing there, working closely with the governments and also other bodies. The study shows that the indigenous people, local communities, women in the preparation of the national climate change discourse, especially national adaptation plan or national determined contribution NDC or national communication on climate change. So very low engagement and participation. So in this one, how would you deal with the issues and concerns of the indigenous people on the ground? This assessment clearly shows that we are discussing more on superficial manner on the surface, not really touching on the ground. And then another part is, the COP26 in Glasgow decided with the 5 governments and 17 private funders, $1.7 billion on the 10 years and safeguarding indigenous peoples and local community rights. However, now it's almost a year, and now we are already in the mouth of COP27. There has been hardly any efforts that we have not even felt and experienced the seriousness of the funder and the relevant agencies and the commitments they have committed. So it's kind of more showing like you committed, but not really responsible. That also would like to share with you my own real experience. In my recent study on the indigenous peoples and how they are benefited from this carbon emission reduction or the carbon fund, the study really shows that it's still ongoing. It's going to be published maybe hopefully by the end of this year. That shows like, there's also kind of illusion. It shows like 80% of the carbon fund goes to the community, but in fact, if you see the structure and the procedures and mechanism of the benefit sharing of the carbon fund to the communities, hardly drops can be felt by the indigenous people on the ground, because there's no recognition of the rights, there's no recognition of cultural value, there's no recognition of customer institution. That's the one binding for their survival and the continuation of the traditional livelihoods. Then another part is also, in the name of the climate solution, now we can have already realized that increasing conservation and national park and, and that has been a really, really big threat for indigenous people, especially the 30 by 30 program in the CBD that, post biodiversity framework concept is a possible of continuation of the eviction of indigenous peoples and local communities from their own ancestral land. And turning and torturing and continuation of torturing and criminalization of indigenous people across Asia, and I'm sure this is also similar in Africa and Latin America. So just one few examples is the recent death of Rajkumar, one of the indigenous young in Chiton National Park in during this pandemic, and most recently in June, actually, many tortured and brutalized, and even death of Navina Tharu in the national park in June 2022, very recently. This is one of the few examples, many in Asia. Then another false solution I would like to share in the Green Climate Fund. So, the UNFCCC decision with the Green Climate Fund, and we all are so happy, praise, oh, we have a Green Climate Fund and dedicated fund for the developing country to deal with the climate change adaptation and mitigation. But from my experience that I understand Green Climate Fund, when my daughter was just only 11 months, my daughter is now 6.5. But in the due course of time, I feel the continuation of feeling indigenous people, like the GCF fund is like a star in the sky, this kind of dreamy kind of things, is still continued, because hardly any kind of drops of the GCF funded funds for the dedicated for indigenous people and indigenous people to practice our own livelihoods and continuation of our traditional practices and knowledge system. So that also shows, we have a GC of IP policy, we have a gender policy, we have a social environment policy, but that policy remains on the policy without an implementation on the ground. And therefore, in the name of climate change discourse, or in the name of the climate change adaptation mitigation, or in the protection of biodiversity, and the continuation of the violation of indigenous people's rights, especially even the rights enshrined by the ILO 169, UN DRIP, even the Paris Agreement, that has hardly been addressed and implemented. So I just would like to share, out of the total population of indigenous people, more than 70% are in Asia. And more than out of the 70% of the indigenous people, like in 900 countries, 70% is still living in the forest. So anything to deal with the forest in the name of the climate change, adaptation, mitigation, or carbon funding. It is very important that issues and concerns of indigenous peoples be heard, and make sure that rights of indigenous people, especially continuation of our traditional livelihoods, our practices, our knowledge and skills that has contributed for climate change resilience, not violated, but in fact protected, promoted, and enhanced and recognized, and that has hardly been there. And another part is also that indigenous people around the world, indigenous people and local communities now in Asia, almost 150 indigenous people, local community living in protected area, so covering almost 15.3% in Asia. The study shows that from Dawn 2022 shows that 859.2 billion people live in non-protected area. But in the mouth of 30 by 30 program, there is a high possibility of overlapping 23.8% and violation, continuation of violation of indigenous people if the protected area expanded by 30% by 2030. So this is a really another issues for indigenous people, how we can respect the rights so that, and how can we have the right-based conservation, a right-based climate solution without any false solution, but the real solution that dealing with the real people on the ground who have been the guardian of the whole ecosystem, forest and biodiversity. And then I would like to also share one of the very important outcome that I was in COP26 in the Glasgow. I was leading, facilitating different activities of the LCIP and moderating with the governments and the bilateral, multilateral agencies. One of the issue of indigenous people, around the world is not indigenous people being demystifying or just representing objectively, just presenting like vulnerable, but make sure to present the indigenous people as the real actors, the safeguarders. Then the solution comes up. But so far, even including IPCC or other study, continuing showing the indigenous people vulnerable and to be dealt with by someone else. But in fact, indigenous people's voice is not need to be dealt with, but give the power and be present as an actor, and so that the solution comes up. So I was invited in one of the panels, high-level panel of the IPCC, to assess on the assessment report of the sixth. And in the IPCC panel, the presidential high level, I presented that I focused that, if you really want to deal with the climate crisis, that you do not just want to focus on the climate science, but balance with the indigenous knowledge science, so that we'll have indigenous knowledge at the equal footing as the science, and we can come up with a holistic solution. Otherwise, just only presenting indigenous people as vulnerable is not the invitation of the solution. So it was a little bit improved. I mean, there was some kind of outcome of the sixth assessment report presence, which is a little bit improving in comparison to the earlier reports that shows that indigenous knowledge system are derived from the surrounding environment and essential to global efforts to deal with the climate crisis. And another part I just would like to highlight that also presents the recognition of inherent rights of indigenous people as an integral part of the climate adaptation. So this is a little bit, changing perception of the IPCC towards the indigenous people, which is good, but this is not enough, because but for really holistic solution to climate change, it is very important that indigenous peoples on the same equal footing, on the same table as the science to deal with this global crisis. And then so therefore, all this, as we have already discussed this afternoon, that there has been a lot of things is going on, but little impacts on the ground. And despite the important role and contribution of indigenous people and our customer institution, our self-governance system in the sustainable management of the natural resources, ecosystem, and biodiversity, our role and contribution are hardly reflected in the climate discourse, either at the global level, at the national level. Consequently, our knowledge, our skills, our values are disappearing day by day from the young generation. Therefore, today in this important event, I would like to urge that the right-based climate solution is the only solution with the recognition of indigenous people, local communities, women's role and contribution, and our customer institution governance system, and protection of indigenous knowledge and cultural values to deal with the global crisis and the climate resilience. With this one, I'll stop, and if there is any queries, I'll be happy to respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pasang. What a powerful message to sort of tie everything that we've talked about today together. Thank you. That was incredible. Fantastic. And also very grateful that you shared your personal experiences from COP, and absolutely important that we stop referring to indigenous communities as only being vulnerable. Absolutely. Absolutely, as the main actors. Yes, that was fantastic. Yes, so I'm throwing open the floor for question and answers. I'm sure all of you have a lot of things to say, so please feel free to either put your hand up or put it in the chat, and you can ask questions to Pasang and Siti. While we wait for comments, I just want to mention that it looks like we might be a little bit short on time when it comes to playing trivia, but we will have the trivia game in subsequent events that we have. So I'm sure all of us will get to play it together at some point. But what we will do is we will share the a slide deck that we had prepared on climate change solutions. Corina will put the links in the chat, and you can see the slide deck and see some of the, like, really, it's like it's a great reference point to understand these issues better. So yeah, Corina will share it in the link. You feel free to download it and share it and use it. Yeah, there it is. Okay, now I'm going to read out this one question that came up earlier when I think Titi was speaking. Nikita says, thanks to all the presenters. In the backdrop of market-based solutions to climate change, I'm wondering, how do we see opportunities to influence or advocate in spaces like COP and wider UNFCCC process for people-centered and equality and justice-based perspectives to these issues? Also, given that these spaces set the tone for governments across Asia, and their response, and where they put their money, or rather where they put our money, right? Would either of you, Titi or Pasang, would you like to respond to that? How do we see opportunities to influence this? Yeah, Titi, go ahead.
So there is already access that we can intervene, or we can raise questions, concern, and so on. The problem is we don't have control over decision making, and that's what we need to pursue. You know, the situation, we need also to really strengthen communities, our communities and our civil society, you know, because it is not only about space to intervene, but it is really about how to change the power relations among the developed country, but also at national level among the states and their people. And within the people and the state, we also see women as, you know, one of the actors of part of the society who are oppressed under patriarchy. So it means if we want to system change, we need to change all the injustices that we see in our face, that we see related to the relation with the government and within the others developing countries. So then I think, it is very important to have this rigorous capacity building and knowledge building within the community, because community already face the climate change, but when they ask the government support, that is one of our experience. The local government only say, it's natural disaster, what we can do. So it means really knowledge and information for people, the situations, what is actually happening, and what they can do to achieve their rights because of this situation. It's really important. Yeah, so I think changing in the power relationship is very important to do.
Absolutely, Titi. Yes, that is on point indeed. Pasang, would you like to respond to that?
Okay, thank you, Chikula, and thank you for the question. I just would like to share my own experience. How can we have our how can we influence in the decision making? So whether it's in the COP or any or at the national levels, no. So one of the experience I have had is changing the perception, the attitude, the lenses. It's very, very important. No? In the national level, I have also worked with the governments and also bilateral, multilateral agencies. I have also worked at the global level. And right from the beginning, if the perception towards indigenous people or women or local community is not correct, no matter how much you crave, or no matter how much you make yourself like a champion, there's a hardly space. So the first is very important is we change our we develop the situation or develop the environment in such a way that the policymakers or agents has a mind to listen to us and with the open perception, not with the stigmatized kind of notion that what these EIPs can, indigenous people can do it, what these women can do it, what this local community can do it. We are the scientists, we are the we are the government agencies. So if we have that kind of attitude, it's very difficult to convince. And then because I have already worked in the from region representing from Asia in the past in the local community indigenous people platform as one of the constituent bodies of the UNCCC. So that has tried to develop a space for indigenous people and the state parties to have openly hear each others, because I feel like the capacity build up is not only enough for indigenous people, local communities, but the capacity of the government agency, the state parties, negotiators, to understand the role and contribution of indigenous people, the issues and concerns of indigenous people and local community women is equally important. Then the dialogue begins, and then the effective negotiation starts.
Absolutely, Pasang. Thank you. I see Suparna has his hand up. Go ahead.
I think I think Pasang has raised this issue very strongly. And yes, just for example, if you see the nationally determined contribution and see as rightly put their response and where they put our money. So far, I don't know how many of the NDCs that have been submitted have been prepared with the participation of the indigenous people, local communities, women's group, and other vulnerable communities. Perhaps none. Very, very rare. And so it's a kind of a government preparing at its own sweet will, its own NDC, and how they will spend our money. And if you see the Paris rule book, it's clearly written the NDCs, preparation of the NDCs have to be participatory. It has to be transparent. It has to be accountable to the people. None of it happens so far. So they're putting our money and they are having their own response to the climate change crisis. And perhaps we need to strongly intervene at our national level, also through the process of preparation of the NDCs.
Thank you. Thank you, Suparna. Yes, absolutely. We have a question for Titi. Very insightful presentation, Titi. This is from Vaishnavi. Could you share with us how we can push for more transformative solutions with regards to gender impacts of climate solutions instead of the limited solutions that are often proposed in the name of gender and climate agenda? For example, in India, energy projects, fossil fuel-based large hydro and renewable energy, have been promoted in the name of energy access for women for cooking and household needs, but they rarely acknowledge women's connection to natural resources and the structural impacts faced by women.
Should I answer now?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. It is not like, an instant answer because it is a process. Even as I informed before, even the community already face sea level rise and they have to go from that place. Even they don't know that it's climate change. They know there is sea level rise and the local government say it is natural. You cannot do against it, So it means rigorous knowledge building about climate change. It is important. Make the people powerful that they can ask questions, they can push for demands, and they can defend their rights. That is important. And of course, we need to communicate with the governments too. We need to talk with them because they need also education about what is climate change and what is false solution. So there are a lot of things that should be done, not in linear way, but parallel, multiple things like that. And, I think it is a process that we have to go, that we have to fight for that. And I believe in the power of people. So if people are strong in this, they know the situations, they're aware that this is their rights to ask for support if they are in troubles because of the climate change, that is their rights. And it is also their rights to defend that their lands are not grabbed by particular climate projects on the name of the climate solution. Things like that. That's what I can say. Thanks.
Yes, indeed, the power of the people. Yeah, absolutely. Bassam, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I would like to add one more thing. Actually, I agree, Titi, no doubt. I mean, but I just would like to add, if we really want to have a climate solution, the real actors should be in the forefront, and a forefront to deal with that one. But what happens at the moment is the real solution is at the behind the curtain, and the false actor is in the front. So we are having false solution. So if you really want to have a real solution, bring the real actors, which is being put aside, which is being behind the curtain or under the table. That has how the stocks are being built on, and then the real action will come up. That is what I believe.
Great, thank you so much. That is a great note for us to conclude today on. I just want to say that the link that Corina shared, Corina, if you could share the link again, that would be great, to the resource, the slide deck that we would like all of you to share and download and use. It has a link to additional resources as well, so please feel free to download it. Please feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions or want to take the conversation forward. But thank you so much to everyone who made this event possible, everyone who attended, asked insightful questions, and of course, our speakers, Fasang, Titi, Neth, and of course, Stephen, for giving us so much incredible information in such a short period of time. And of course, the rest of the team, rest of my team at GSC, Suparna, Corina, thank you so much for giving us all an opportunity to come together. So yeah, have a great rest of the day, and looking forward to meeting you all again in real life as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. Bye bye, everyone.